So let me get into the history of this whole area. And like I said, it's important. This is the kind of person that I am. I go back, I hear these situations, I say, let me go back and find out what the hell is going on here. I don't care what CNN has to say about it. I don't care what Fox News has to say about it. I don't care what the New York Times and the Washington Post have to say about it. I want to find out the history, and I have not seen any of those sources, not one, go back to the 1870s when this area was settled and bring people up to speed, and they'll demonstrate how we got to where we are today with finally somebody stood up and pushed back against the federal government. Why do we have a Bureau of Land Management? That agency should be abolished. It's one of the many others that I've talked about. This alphabet soup of federal agencies that does nothing but send out its officers to harass people. The Bureau of Land Management. If you look at a map of federally owned land west of the Mississippi, it's a color-coded map. It's in red, the land owned by the federal government. Practically the entire western portion of the United States of America, west of the Mississippi, is land owned by the federal government. Why does the federal government own land outside of Washington, D.C.? That's the only area that the Bureau of Land Management should be worried about. The public spaces in the federal district, not the state of Arizona, not the state of Nevada, not the state of California, not the state of Colorado, the District of Columbia. But you see, it's another one of those examples of this overreaching, overbearing federal government that is intruding more and more into our lives. This issue out in Burns, Oregon, is really an issue about private property. And if you're going to stand here and tell me that you're a conservative, you believe in the Constitution, you support private property rights, which is the hallmark of our democracy, by the way, here in the United States. We respect private property. The framers respected private property. Most of the Bill of Rights centered around private property. Fourth Amendment, unreasonable searches and seizures had to do with private property. So I want you to listen to this. I want you to listen closely as to what went on, and then we'll go back to January 4th when this thing happened. Whereas all you're going to get if you turn on that idiot box called the TV or pick up that propaganda piece known as the New York Times, you're going to get their version minus any of the history of this area. Anyway, this is an open source briefing that I got, so this is available. There's nothing sensitive in here that I'm going to share with you. The Harney Basin, where the Hammond Ranch is established, Hammond is the family that's in dispute with the federal government right now, was settled in the 1870s. The valley was settled by multiple ranchers and was known to have run over 300,000 head of cattle. These ranchers developed a state-of-the-art irrigation system to water the meadows, and it soon became a favorite stopping place for migrating birds on their annual trek north. In 1908, President Theodore Roosevelt, in a political scheme, created an Indian reservation around the Malheur Mud and Harney Lakes and declared it as a preserve and breeding ground for native birds. Later, this Indian reservation, without Indians, by the way, became the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. In 1964, the Hammonds, that's the family, purchased their ranch in the Harney Basin, 1964. Their purchase included about 600,000 acres of private property for their cattle. By the 1970s, nearly all the ranchers adjacent to the Blitzen Valley were purchased by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's going to be important later on, ladies and gentlemen. And it was added to the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. The expansion of the refuge grew in surroundings and surrounds to the Hammond Ranch. So this area grew. Being approached many times by the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Hammonds refused to sell. That was their mistake, according to the federal government. Other ranchers also choose not to sell. During the 1970s, the Fish and Wildlife Service, in conjunction with the Bureau of Land Management, took a different approach to get the ranchers to sell. And we'll pick up from there. Just take over a vacant building in a wildlife refuge on federal land. And I misspoke in the first segment about this long train of abuses by the federal government. I meant to say King George and the Crown, but today, fast forwarding it, there's not much difference. So getting back here to the history, we're going to do this my way, the right way, so that you can make a decision as to whose side you're on out in Burns, Oregon, based on the history of this situation. Ranchers were told that grazing was detrimental to wildlife and must be reduced. 32 out of the 53 permits were revoked, and many ranchers were forced to leave. Grazing fees were raised significantly for those who were allowed to remain. Refuge personnel took over the irrigation system, claiming it as their own. Refuge personnel, by the way, are federal officers. By 1980, a conflict was well on its way over water allocation on the adjacent property owned Sylvie's Plain. The FWS, that's the Fish and Wildlife Service, wanted to acquire the ranch lands on the Sylvie's Plain to add to their already vast holdings. By the 1990s, the Hammonds were one of the very few ranchers that still owned private property adjacent to the refuge. In the early 1990s, the Hammonds filed on a livestock water source and obtained a deed for the water right from the state of Oregon. When the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service found out that the Hammonds obtained new water rights near the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, they were agitated and became belligerent and vindictive toward the Hammonds. The Fish and Wildlife Service challenged the Hammonds' right to the water in an Oregon state court. The court found that the Hammonds legally obtained rights to the water in accordance to state law, more rights for the states that I support, and therefore the use of the water belongs to the Hammonds. In August of 1994, Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service illegally began building a fence around the Hammonds' water source. Owning the water rights and knowing that their cattle relied on that water source daily, the Hammonds tried to stop the building of the fence. The BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service called the Harney County Sheriff's Department, and they had Dwight Hammond, the father, arrested and charged with disturbing and interfering with federal officials or federal contracts, 2 counts, each a felony. The Fish and Wildlife Service also began restricting access to upper pieces of the Hammonds' private property. In order to get to the upper part of the Hammonds Ranch, they had to go on a road that went through the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. Shortly after the road and water disputes, the BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service arbitrarily revoked the Hammonds' upper grazing permit without any given cause, court proceeding, or court ruling. As a traditional fence-out state, Oregon requires no obligation on the part of an owner to keep his or her wild stock within a fence or maintain control over the movement of the livestock. The Hammonds intend to still use their private property for grazing. However, they were informed that a federal judge ruled in a federal court that the federal government did not have to observe the Oregon fence-out law. Quote in the ruling, "Those laws are for the people, not for them." Typical federal government. Those laws are for the people, not for the government. The Hammonds were forced to either build and maintain miles of fences or be restricted from the use of their private property. Cutting their ranch in almost half, they could not afford to fence the land, so the cattle were removed. The Hammonds experienced many years of financial hardship due to the ranch being diminished. The Hammonds had to sell their ranch and home in order to purchase another property that had enough grass to feed their cattle. This property included 2 grazing rights on public land. So see, they're trying to do the right thing. This new property included 2 grazing rights on public land. Those were also arbitrarily revoked later. In the early fall of 2001, Steven Hammond called the fire department, informing him that he was going to be performing a routine prescribed burn on their ranch. Later that day, he started that prescribed fire on their private property. The fire ended up going onto public land and burned 127 acres of grass. The Hammonds put out the fire themselves. Prescribed fires are a common method that Native Americans and ranchers have used in the area to increase the health and productivity of the lands for many centuries. In 2006, a massive lightning storm started multiple fires that joined together, inflaming the countryside. To prevent the fire from destroying their winter range and possibly their home, Steven Hammond, the son, started a backfire on their private property. The backfire was successful in putting out the lightning fires that had covered thousands of acres within a short period of time. The backfire saved much of the range and vegetation needed to feed the cattle through the winter. The next day, federal agents went to the Harney County Sheriff's Office and filed a police report making accusation against Dwight and Steven Hammond for starting the backfire. A few days after the backfire, a range con from the Burns District BLM office asked Steven if he would meet him in town for coffee. Steven accepted. When leaving, he was arrested by the Harney County Sheriff's Office and the BLM ranger. The Harney County District Attorney reviewed the accusation evidence and charges and determined that the accusations against Dwight and Steven Hammond did not warrant prosecution and dropped all the charges. In 2011, this is a continued harassment by the federal government. In 2011, 5 years after the police report was taken, the U.S. Attorney's Office accused Dwight and Steven Hammond of completely different charges. They accused them of being terrorists under the Federal Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This act carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. A minimum sentence of 5 years in prison and a maximum sentence of death. Think about this. It's profound and it's unfathomable that something like this could go on. So then they have to go through all these court proceedings. You know what that does. The federal government just bleeds you to death. They know that you do not have all of the resources to continue to take them on. So back to the story here. On January 4th, 2013, Dwight and Steven reported to prison because on June 22nd, the year before, Dwight and Steven were found guilty of starting both the fires in 2001 and 2006 by a jury. However, the federal courts convicted both as terrorists under the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act. The judge in the case sentenced the father, Dwight, to 3 months in prison, and Steven, the son, to 12 months in federal prison. Sometime in June of 2014, Rhonda Carges, field manager for the BLM, and her husband, they, along with an attorney, Frank Papagani, exemplifying further vindictive behavior, filed an appeal with the 9th District Federal Court seeking Dwight and Steven's return to federal prison for the entire 5 years because they went to prison and served the term, and they were released in January of 2014. So then these federal people go back because they wanted to bring the hammer. So in October of 2015, the 9th District Court resentenced Dwight and Steven, requiring them to return to prison for several more years. During the court proceeding, the Hammonds were forced to grant the Bureau of Land Management first right of refusal. If the Hammonds ever sold their ranch, they'd have to sell it to the BLM. So on January 4th of 2016, which was last week, they showed up and reported to begin their resentencing. To date, they have paid $200,000 to the BLM, and the remaining $200,000 must be paid before the end of the year of 2015. If the Hammonds cannot pay the fines to the BLM, they will be forced to sell their ranch to the BLM or face further prosecution. Folks, we can have an intelligent conversation. We can have an informed conversation because now you're up to speed as to what happened going back to the 1870s near Burns, Oregon. And after listening to that series of events, how can you claim to be a freedom-loving conservative, a believer in the Constitution of the United States, the founding fathers, the framers, the Declaration of Independence, and not be on the side of the Hammonds and their family right now? How? Explain it to me. I don't really care whose side you're on. I know whose side I'm on. And I know there are a lot of people on the right who are, their stomach can't handle this kind of stuff. This is sometimes a bridge too far. When we start talking about patriots taking a stand, like the signers of the Declaration of Independence, that I'm holding in my hand the action of Second Continental Congress, July 4, 1776. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people, it is their duty to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This is not once upon a time. That's sometimes how we treat these documents. The Declaration and the Constitution, especially this current administration, is lawlessness. King George, King Barack. It's as if these documents were just once upon a time. If we lose hold of these documents that are the foundation of the very country that we love and live in today, and we're done as a republic. We'll be something else, but we won't be a republic. We will not be a constitutional republic. We will have retrogressed back into the early 1700s under King George and Great Britain. Nothing more than subjects to the monarchy. Not citizens, subjects. Is that what you want? It's not what I want. When are we going to have that pitchforks and torches moment? When are we going to have it? Or are we going to sit around and just wait for the next election? And if we can just get a Republican in the White House, this will all be righted. No, it won't. As this document says, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. That's all we're doing right now. Don't kid yourself. What are you willing to do about this? I know what the people out in Burns, Oregon are willing to do. That small band of patriots. And like I said, people on the right, let's, sit down and let's work this out. There's no working anything out with this federal government. We're $18 trillion in debt and rising. The Congress just passed an omnibus spending bill of $1.2 trillion, which funded all of Barack Obama's priorities. I'm through waiting for the next election. I will continue to vote, but if you think I'm going to sit around waiting for that, thinking that's going to be that magic moment, then you don't know the people's share.